AFIO Now is presented by Northwest Financial Advisors, where our world revolves around you.
Hello, everyone. This is Jim Hughes with AFIO Now. We are a program of recorded interviews with former senior U.S. intelligence officers. And today I'm welcoming back a very special guest. Several weeks ago, we did a recording with him about the early parts of his career when he was a U.S. Special Forces officer and a paramilitary officer at CIA. Today, we're going to resume our interview and talk about the latter portions of his career when he held a couple of senior positions at DoD. His name is Mike Vickers. He has a brand new book out, by all means available. It's a delightful read. I recommend it to you all. And I want to welcome Mike back to the program.
Pleasure to be with you, Jim.
Mike, so when we ended the interview last time, you talked a little bit about your reasons for leaving CIA and going back to get a couple of advanced degrees. And then I understand you worked in the private sector for a few years, but then you came back to government. Who and what brought you back into the USG?
So, I did. I got an MBA and then eventually a Ph.D., but did most of the work while I was out of government and just finished my dissertation. And when I left CIA, I thought the rise of China was the next big thing. And, Cold War was over. And I was done with intelligence and covert action and special operations and Afghanistan and counterterrorism. And I was wrong about all that. 9/11 showed me, and even also I would add the breakup of the Soviet Union and decline of Russia, and they eventually came back as well. And so, but the only thing I got right was China. And so as the Iraq War was not going well, President Bush triggered a strategic review and wanted a range of strategy advice. And so I was asked to go into the Oval Office and meet with him with two very distinguished generals, Wayne Downing, who commanded Special Operations Command, and Barry McCaffrey, who had led one of our divisions in Desert Storm and ended up as our Southern Command commander, and then drug to offer our thoughts. And after the meeting on Iraq, President pulled me aside and said he had just read this book, Charlie Wilson's War, about our efforts in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and particularly at CIA, and particularly Congressman Wilson's contributions in adding a lot of funds to the program, and asked me a lot of questions about the book, and then asked me, well, why'd you leave CIA? And that one flustered me a fair amount because I didn't really have a good answer. I still have mixed feelings about whether I made the right decision or not. And so he thanked me, and then a couple of weeks later, I was asked to go again to Camp David, where the president and his war cabinet was meeting on Iraq. And so all the top military generals in Iraq and chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld at the time, Secretary of State, UN ambassador, a number of them, CIA director, and to offer again my views on kind of Iraq strategy. And then I got a call from the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Eric Edelman, in the Bush administration, and said, can you come into the Pentagon? I want to talk to you about the Camp David meeting. And so, sure. I was doing a lot of consulting for DoD at the time. And he said, okay, I know about Camp David. The president's calling Secretary Rumsfeld a lot and saying, we've got to get Mike back into government. So we're going to create this position called Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict, and Interdependent Capabilities. And it's a real mouthful. But the first part of that job, ASD SOLIC, was created by Congress in 1987 with Special Operations Command, to have the Pentagon civilian oversight of Special Operations Command. And then what they added to it, the interdependent capabilities part, was all our operational forces that I would have policy oversight over. So nuclear weapons, space, cyber, missile defense, all the strategic forces, and then conventional force transformation, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, what they're going to look like in 20 years and the guidance. And so it was just, and of course then special operations forces and counterterrorism. And so it matched pretty much everything I had been doing in the private sector and consulting in terms of transforming the military, posturing ourselves to deal with China. And I really wanted to get back into the fight, particularly with Al-Qaeda. And so I accepted the job, and it was for the last 2 years of the Bush administration. And then President Obama asked Bob Gates to stay on as Secretary of Defense, Jim Clapper, as at the time the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, later DNI, and then me in that Assistant Secretary job.
I had the pleasure of working a little bit with General Wayne Downing toward the end of my career. Sadly, he's no longer with us.
Right. Great man.
Yeah. Mike, please describe to our office what the Predator proposal was all about.
So, right after 9/11, we mounted this great campaign led by CIA and the Counterterrorism Center, George Tenet, and then Cofer Black as the chief of counterterrorism, and Hank Crumpton as the key deputy, to work with the Northern Alliance with special forces, CIA officers, and others, and then U.S. air power to displace the Taliban. Very successful regime was deposed in 2 months. But then Al-Qaeda scattered. Bin Laden got away. And at first, as you know, there were a lot of operations to capture Al-Qaeda leaders in the settled areas of Pakistan, the cities essentially east of the Indus. But eventually, Al-Qaeda found sanctuary again in the federally administered tribal areas. And the threat started growing. And in 2006, we had the transatlantic airliner plot to blow up 10 airliners flying out of the UK to the United States, kill maybe 3,000 people with improvised explosives. It's why we have these TSA restrictions since then, and it was fortunately broken up. And a national intelligence estimate showed that the homeland threat had really risen again as Al-Qaeda had reestablished its sanctuary with like-minded groups like the Pakistan Taliban and the Haqqanis. And so President Bush wanted a new strategy. Our strategy in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region wasn't working. And we were, of course, at war in Iraq and Afghanistan still. And the insurgency was picking up. And the Predator aircraft, essentially armed reconnaissance drone with great endurance and precision weapons and a suite of different kinds of sensors, was in really short supply. It was developed in the late 90s, used without weapons in Afghanistan for the first time in September 2000, where we got a glimpse of Bin Laden, but couldn't do anything about it. Then it was armed and was able to be used a bit late 2001 in the toppling the Taliban regime, and then a few times around the world in the next 5 years. But we didn't have enough of these aircraft. We only had 6 or so when I became an assistant secretary. 6 orbits, as we say. It takes typically about 3 aircraft to have 24/7 coverage over an area. And so we embarked on a great program to expand that, which we eventually did to like 65. So we increased it by a factor of more than 10, and with a surge capability to 85. And they were mostly in Iraq. We had a few of them dedicated to the counterterrorism mission against Al-Qaeda, 3 aircraft to be specific, 3 orbits to be specific. But we would need a lot more, and hence its expansion. We would also need a new strategy. And so I was asked to work with a few elements from DOD and the White House and then CIA to put together a strategy that would deal with this new Al-Qaeda sanctuary in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. And the elements of the strategy involved more predator strikes, which would mean more predators and different policies associated with that, cross-border special operations raids, and a couple of other lines of operation I can't talk about because they're still classified. And then capture operations with the Pakistanis, Pakistani intelligence. And the policy changes that were so important involved, first, we only took strikes with Pakistani approval between 2004 and 2008. And so we had done not quite 36 strikes, but the Pakistanis had made a deal with militants in North Waziristan to leave them alone in 2006. And so they got tighter and tighter. And so in 2007, as this threat was really gathering to the homeland, we weren't able to do any strikes against al-Qaeda high-value targets. And Mike Hayden, former director of CIA, famously said we were 0 for 07, 0 HVT strikes in 2007. And that was kind of the breaking point for President Bush. And the reason for that was the Pakistanis would either delay until the target had moved and we lost custody, or they would just disapprove it in the first case. And so the first change was to essentially move to unilateral operations and notify the Pakistanis concurrently after we did the strike, rather than before and seeking approval. And that made a big, big difference. The second big change involved a number of changes to targeting policy. So first we introduced this thing called signature strikes, which there's kind of two kinds of predator strikes. Personality, who the target you're going after is, it's Joe Blow. Or in a signature strike, it's a senior al-Qaeda leader based on certain signatures or tradecraft, the way they operate, and watch them for a long time, but you don't know the exact identity. You don't know which one it is. You may have an idea, but you don't know that. And that became a very important policy innovation. And then expanding the list to more al-Qaeda leaders and to their safe haven providers was the third element of those policy changes. And all of them added up, the unilateral strikes and these more predators and the change in strategy, to great success in 2008. So in the last few months of 2008, we took 8 al-Qaeda high-value targets off the battlefield. And Mike Hayden famously said we were 8 for 08 rather than 0 for 07. And we developed this strategy between 2007 and 2008, and it was interrupted for a while. We couldn't implement it because Pakistan went into political turmoil. Musharraf was losing his grip on power. He'd lost the confidence of the army, and he had lawyers rebelling against him, and that played out over several months. So we had about a 6-month delay before we could implement this strategy. And then I was chosen to brief President Bush and the national security team for his final approval in August 2008 that signed off on all this. And then Mike Hayden, Steve Hadley, the national security advisor, and I went around to the key congressional leaders when they came back in Labor Day, essentially, to brief them on the new campaign. And the campaign produced dramatic results. By 2010, it was successfully transitioned between President Bush and President Obama. By 2010, al-Qaeda tried to just hunker down and not conduct planning. And the intensity of strikes continued through 2012 and really suppressed the threat emanating from that region.
Mike, as you know well, while al-Qaeda had a very substantial base in Afghanistan, they also dispersed to a number of other regions. Delineate for our audience some of these other AQ localities.
Sure. So, one of the successes of al-Qaeda, besides its centralized control and planning operations against the United States, was its ability to spread and through franchises or affiliates. And so the, core al-Qaeda was in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, in Afghanistan before 9/11, and then the federally administered tribal areas primarily in Pakistan after. And so the next most dangerous affiliate to core al-Qaeda was al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And that was formed as a merger of al-Qaeda in Yemen and al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia into one group in 2006. And steadily it became not only a bigger threat to Yemen, but a threat to Saudi Arabia. They did an assassination attempt against the Interior Minister, Mohammed bin Nayef, and the bomb and improvised explosive. And a number of homeland threats emerged out of there. In 2009, we had a Army major who stood up on a table at a medical facility in Fort Hood and started yelling Allahu Akbar and started shooting people, killing 13 and wounding 30. And he had been in touch with a American citizen in Yemen, Anwar al-Awlaki, who was kind of organizing these external plots. And then a few months later, Christmas 2009, we had the underwear bomber, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalib, who was on I think Northwest Airlines, if I remember right, flight to Detroit, and had improvised explosives in his underwear and tried to detonate them. Didn't work. It cost him a few problems in his private parts, but narrow escape from a blown up aircraft. The bomb was solid. It should have worked, and it just didn't. And then later we had another plot where they tried to send explosive printer cartridges to the United States. We took out Anwar al-Awlaki in a drone strike in September 2011, required special review by the Department of Justice, given he was a U.S. citizen, and did a number of other operations in Yemen to try to tamp down the threat between 2008 and 2014, and particularly as Yemen transitioned governments from the Saleh regime that I know you know well for 31 years to the Hadi regime, and then unfortunately the Houthis took over. The second most dangerous threat in terms of homeland attack was a group that formed in Syria, first Jabhat al-Nusra and then splinter groups for al-Qaeda. And al-Qaeda, after Arab Spring, and it spread different places, Libya and elsewhere in the Syrian civil war, al-Qaeda leadership really thought that Syria was going to be the next great battleground, that it was finally in the heart of the Arab world, and that's where things would take place. And as this threat grew, and I would add what became ISIS, the Islamic State from Iraq, formerly al-Qaeda in Iraq and lots of other names, had also reconstituted itself in Syria. So you had these dueling jihadist groups. And they also developed sophisticated bomb-making technology. I would also, just let me go back for a second, al-Qaeda in Yemen had this very sophisticated bomb maker, Ibrahim al-Asiri, who was killed, I think, in 2017 or 2018. But he was the guy who tried to blow up Mohammed bin Nayef and designed all these crazy bombs. So he was definitely a global threat. And there were similar things in Syria, threats to Europe and elsewhere. And then al-Qaeda had a group, East Africa al-Qaeda, but eventually merged into a group called al-Shabaab in Somalia. And a number of al-Qaeda veterans from the embassy bombings in '98 for a third front. And Yemen and Somalia were kind of an integrated theater, as Syria and Iraq were. And since I mentioned Iraq, al-Qaeda had a franchise there from 2004 on, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, mostly focused on defeating the U.S. occupation of Iraq, but plotting other attacks in the region and carrying a few out, as you know, in Jordan and a few other places. And that group eventually was battered down, but morphed into the Islamic State, recovered in Syria, and then came back to invade Iraq later. And then a group that had been in North Africa, the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, became al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, mostly Algeria, northern Mali, and Niger. mostly focused on kidnapping and ransoms, but occasionally a threat to Europe and elsewhere. And let's see, who have I missed? Then the final one, I think in 2014, Al Qaeda established a local affiliate. It's the only one it created from the ground up, called Al Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, that was kind of co-located with core Al Qaeda in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, but had operations in India and Bangladesh in addition to Pakistan. So, it was a global franchise stretching essentially from Mali to Bangladesh, and then with other groups like Jamaah Islamiyah in Indonesia and elsewhere, and Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines, that also other Salafist groups also contributed to Al Qaeda's global reach.
Mike, as you well know, there were several successful operations against these dispersed elements of AQ. Describe a couple of those for our audience.
Sure. So we use different strategies against the different groups and concentrated our predator resources on the most dangerous ones. So core Al Qaeda in Yemen, principally, and then a bit the Al Qaeda groups in Syria, although that soon became an ISIS problem as well. And in Somalia, we used a range of things, including African Union forces to drive al-Shabaab out of Mogadishu, and partner forces and the French as well in North Africa. So different strategies in different theaters. And of course, Iraq was a war zone. And so one operation I describe in the book was a raid we did against the East African al-Qaeda leader, Saleh Nabhan, who was very operational security savvy, much like Bin Laden and other top al-Qaeda leaders, and very hard to track. And we had tried a missile strike against him one time we located him, but missed, came close but missed. And we finally got a good human source and found that he was going to be leaving a compound going somewhere else. We couldn't strike him in that compound for collateral damage reasons. And so a plan was developed to do an air raid while he was on this drive on this highway. And so the original plan was to use precision guided munitions from a aircraft, drop a small bomb and target the convoy. And then at the last minute, that proved unfeasible for weather and other reasons. And so we switched to little bird helicopters that flew from ships off the coast of Somalia and were able to do a targeted gunship raid against the convoy and able to confirm his DNA, put down SEALs right after the strike, able to confirm his DNA that it was a successful air attack against his small convoy.
Tell our viewers about the actually fairly well-known Maersk, Alabama operation.
Sure. So that was related to Somalia as well, not Al-Qaeda, more piracy. So Maersk, Alabama, there was a big increase in piracy against commercial shipping, going through the Red Sea, even if ships were far offshore. And a group took over this Maersk, Alabama. A movie was made out of it starring Tom Hanks as Captain Phillips. And so we organized a rescue operation for Captain Phillips that involved SEALs parachuting into the water and then getting on other ships and then bringing as the pirates on the ship were running short on water and others and had their little boat behind, brought that boat behind one of our command ships, and then snipers were able to take out the pirates and rescue Captain Phillips. And it was, with choppy surf conditions and everything else, it was really very masterful shooting.
In your view, what are the four important elements of a successful counterterrorism strategy?
So these are the things that we really learned from 9/11 and adapt and put this together over time. And the overall imperative is to deny them sanctuary. Every time we have let these groups have that have aims of hitting the United States, a couple years unmolested, the threat to the United States has gone up. So we saw that before 9/11. We saw that after they reconstituted in the Pakistan border region. The threat went way up until we started attacking that with our new strategy. As the threat increased in Yemen for a couple years, and then in Syria as well. And so, a key lesson there is to deny sanctuary. And then the operational implementation of that, again, with the goal of disrupting plots, trying to dismantle the organization, not just take out its leaders, but its planners, its facilitators, financiers, safe haven providers, et cetera, so that they can't conduct operations, and then ultimately defeat them and prevent their reconstitution. And so both offense and defense was necessary to make this work. Painful lesson learned in 9/11 was that we needed better screening procedures for flights, and also to harden and lock our cockpit doors, so that we couldn't turn aircraft into missiles and crash them into things. And, it sounds like a simple fix, but we didn't do it before 9/11, and we did after. And so that hardening your defenses and scanners, as bomb technology got better and you moved to improvise devices of various kinds and liquid explosives, it was a cat and mouse game, but that first part of hardening your defenses is critical. And, intelligence is obviously a key part of that. And then the second is counterterrorism operations against these groups, even in war zones, but particularly outside of war zones where Al-Qaeda was mostly located, is really an intelligence operation first and foremost, and then some force to either capture or kill the terrorists. It might be a local force, working with liaison, or it might be one of our special operations forces or a predator strike, or whatever the case is. But they're all driven by precise intelligence. I tried to compare in the book, in the covert action campaign against the Soviets in the 1980s, we needed intelligence on Soviet order of battle and the Afghan resistance and targets and a range of things. But it had to be only so precise because we were fighting a large secret war in counterterrorism operations against Al-Qaeda. It was really critically dependent on just precision intelligence. If you didn't have that, you didn't have operations. And so the role of analysts became a lot more operational in counterterrorism than elsewhere. Rather than judging how's the war going, which they did too, it really is targeting and lots of other stuff that's just real precision. So that's the second part. And what we found there too is that as we went into new theater, sometimes we didn't have the assets necessarily we needed. And so it might take us a year and a half or so to really build up the human network to do that kind of targeting, or develop the appropriate SIGINT capabilities if there were, different communications technologies involved where we didn't have the appropriate sensor, and then getting dense imagery coverage with Predator and other things to have a full targeting package, and developed a strategy called find, fix, finish, exploit, and analyze. But the first three are really the key to it outside of war zones. In war zones, the other two become very important. And then the third part really is aggressive offensive operations. You can't just play defense in this world. You've got to strike them to keep them off balance. You have to do raids. The techniques may vary depending on the theater and the appropriateness of the instrument. We might use partner forces to dislodge them, as we did against ISIS with the Syrian Kurds and others. But that constant pressure is really critical to changing the balance. And then the final one is a global counterterrorism network. And it's another thing we had in parts before 9/11, but we really didn't have it in the way we needed it to disrupt plots in Europe or other areas where we couldn't do, or, other areas outside of war zones where we couldn't use these more kinetic instruments. We would have to rely on intelligence and then work with local security forces to disrupt the plot and arrest them. And so that network of sharing intelligence and working with liaison to disrupt these plots became very critical too. And lots of plots never got past that stage because we built this network after 9/11. And again, it took us better part of a decade to really do that, but it paid big dividends. So it's really those four elements: hardened defenses, intelligence-driven operations, aggressive offensive and continuous offensive operations, and then this global network of counterterrorism partners.
Mike, what visibility did you have, and what role did you play in the Abbottabad operation to get Osama bin Laden?
Sure. Well, I had a central role. We found Osama bin Laden in late August 2010, after we were able to follow his courier, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti was his kunya, back to the Abbottabad compound. From the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. And, it was one of the great intelligence operations in history. Lots of people played parts in that, going from, starting with different strategies of trying to analyze where bin Laden's video statements might have him located. That didn't pay dividends. Tracking all his family members, because some family members, particularly sons, were rejoining him in the Fatah and in Pakistan, and sometimes a wife too, one of his multiple wives. And but the one that paid dividends was going after how he communicated with Al Qaeda, which was through this courier. And it took some years. There were some false starts where there was some reporting that the courier was killed and it was actually a brother. It took a while to learn the courier's true name and where he might be located, and then to specifically target him. And so it took 9 years to get from Tora Bora, where bin Laden escaped, in late 2001, to August 2010. And so after we found him, CIA's deputy director, Michael Morrell, took me and the vice chairman aside, and after a deputies meeting in the White House Situation Room, to an intelligence office in the old executive office building. He told us, stay after, I have something important I need to brief you on, and laid out what we knew about this compound at this point. And there were only, and Director Panetta briefed Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen. So there were only 4 of us in the Pentagon, in DOD, aware of this operation for several months, from September to February of September 2010 to February. And a lot of that time was trying to improve the intelligence case, try to get additional collection, because it was a strong case, but it was still a circumstantial one. This house was built. The family that lived there never left. They burned their trash. They had very high walls, including a wall on the 3rd floor balcony. They had no landline, no connection to the internet. Kids didn't go to school. There were still visuals outside of the compound or in the courtyard and things, but, it was strange. And so there was somebody there who did not want to be seen. And Abbottabad is a Shishi area where Pakistanis have, go to escape the heat, and, 35 miles north of Islamabad. And, but no specific evidence tied bin Laden to that. And, we had gotten a few glimpses of him. We called him the pacer. He would walk around a compound courtyard for exercise with trees over it periodically, but that was about it. And at the end of 2010, Director Panetta and Morrell asked me to come over to CIA to work with a small team on developing options to finish Bin Laden. And it's the first time I couldn't wait in my life for Christmas to be over so I could get back to work. And we developed some initial options, airstrikes and raids, and then unilateral operations, a strike or a raid, or bilateral with the Pakistanis, some form of raid, 5 or 6 in all. Took them to the White House, started doing intensive White House meetings beginning in February 2011, including 5 meetings with the president. So lots of deputies meetings, lots of principals meetings, and then 5 with the president to make a decision. And still couldn't tell many people. So slowly we brought in our special operations commander, Admiral Bill McRaven, to start looking at raid options. We had a channel to a B-2 bomber force to do an airstrike, to do targeting, and started fleshing out these options, and then progressively added a few more people, and then to look at air planning and other things. And then in a clandestine facility, we constructed mock-ups so that an assault force could practice. After looking at the collateral damage from a B-2 strike, the president didn't want to go that way. So then it became either a smaller drone strike or a raid of some kind or another. And started rehearsing the raid options, and then bringing more of the force on. I remember when we brought the force in, it was right after the Libyan war started. That ended up toppling Gaddafi, and the assault force all thought it was going to Libya for counterproliferation concerns. And when the CIA analysts told them, we're all in a big hangar, that no, we think we found Bin Laden, and then Admiral McRaven said, okay, we've got to start rehearsing this to see if it's feasible. I got to get back to the president, and then started working that. And then for the actual operation, we decided to do it under CIA authorities for a variety of reasons. And so I was with Director Panetta in CIA for the formal command and control of the operation, with Admiral McRaven reporting to Secretary Panetta. And then the principals were at the White House in that famous photo, just watching the operation passively. And then at the White House, that evening after it. So from start to finish, it was almost 10 months. And, it was the biggest secret in Washington at the time. And, one of the most extraordinary things I've ever been involved in.
Yeah. Well, a great piece of intelligence work and great work by special operations.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. Mike, what was the significance and the result of the Rydell review on Afghan policy in the fall of 2009?
Sure. So it was actually spring of 2009. So, as Afghanistan started deteriorating, the insurgency was getting worse from 2003 on, but really 2006 to 8, it had spread more across the country. And, for a while it was in the Taliban heartland in the south. All the fighting was in the south of Afghanistan after we had kicked the Taliban out. And then started spreading to the eastern provinces and eventually north and west. And so President Bush had actually triggered a couple reviews between 2006 and 2008 and added more troops to Afghanistan. But basically everything we had was going to Iraq. And so at the beginning of the Obama administration, there were several things this was the first wartime transition we had since 1968 across parties, and a wartime transition period. So, among the things transferred was this new strategy to go after al-Qaeda successfully, the Iraq War, which was not yet winding down, but the surge was working, got very successful and started to get successful in 2007 when it was initiated, got very successful in 2008, continued through 2009. But, President Obama had to draw that down gradually. The worsening situation in Afghanistan, and then efforts to try to prevent Iran or delay Iran from getting nuclear weapons. So all those were kind of the big issues on the plate as we transitioned administrations. And so right away, President Obama commissioned a review on Afghanistan policy because more troops were starting to go there, U.S. troops, as the insurgency worsened. So Bruce Rydell, former longtime senior CIA analyst and NSC staffer, was brought in to lead it. And he looked at a number of options and recommended a fully resourced counter, and I participated in this review, senior person for DOD, for counterinsurgency in Afghanistan. Before that, we kind of had a counterterrorism mission up until early 2009, and recommended 21,000 troops, 17,000, mostly half of them Marines, and then the rest Army, and then 4,000 trainers. So 17,000 combat troops, 4,000 trainers and advisors for a total of 21. And so President Obama approved that in late March, 2 months after taking office, essentially, and thought, okay, I've ramped up in Afghanistan, I'm done. And then as the situation continued to get worse, Secretary Gates came to the conclusion that he needed a new commander in Afghanistan. And so he put General Stan McChrystal in the job, replacing Dave McKernan. And then McChrystal did his own review as he took command in the summer of 2009. And he came back with recommendations for large numbers of troops, from as many as 80,000 to 40,000 to something less than that. And that hit like a grenade in Washington, that we thought we just solved the Afghanistan problem, and now you're asking for, doubling or tripling what we just provided, some months ago. And so eventually, it triggered big NSC review by President Obama's NSC and with the president a lot. And by December 2009, compromise kind of worked out by Secretary Gates. President Obama agreed to kind of a split between the 30,000 and 40,000 increase option, 30,000 U.S. troops plus, if I remember right, 6,000 or 7,000 from NATO. That would get us pretty close to the 40,000 that General McChrystal requested. And President Obama put a time limit on this surge of 12 to 18 months. And that then commenced this big surge, 2010 through 2011 in Afghanistan.
Mike, describe your visit to China in 2015. What was the purpose and what were the results?
Sure. So I had gone to China a fair amount. They were our ally in our secret war against the Soviets in the 1980s, but hadn't been back since. And was just too busy in my almost 8 years as a policymaker and IC leader with the war with Al Qaeda and lots of other stuff. And so finally, we had hosted the Chinese several times in the Pentagon, different elements, their Minister of Defense and others. And then I had hosted my counterpart, their head of intelligence in the Pentagon. And he said, well, you haven't been to China in a long time. You ought to come back. And, we had issues we wanted to talk about. They were doing very aggressive cyber operations against us. 5 officers of the PLA were indicted by the Department of Justice for stealing stuff from U.S. companies. And then also too, in any kind of superpower competition, going back to the Cold War, you want lines of communication open for rules of the road at sea, so you don't have maritime incidents that lead to war, or other forms, communications channels, hotlines that you can talk on, etc. So those were kind of the issues on the agenda. And so got in, and and honestly, I thought, this competition with China is heating up since Deng Xiaoping had come to power in 2012, and it's going to continue. And I wanted to get a look at the place, how it had changed since the 1980s, and how their economy was doing, and how high tech it was, and other things. And so I had a visit there. Talked to their equivalent of the National Defense University, met a lot of senior counterparts, including the number two military person under Deng Xiaoping, who almost never met with U.S. officials. I was one of the few that he met with. And then even some special forces units, to show me their techniques and things like that, drawing on my younger days and things. So all in all, it was a good visit, a sobering visit, and made me think about, how we compete with them down the road.
Mike, in your book, you mentioned the transition from Moscow rules to Beijing rules. Describe what that means.
Sure. So for clandestine operations, the as you know better than I, the most difficult ones to encounter is when you've got constant surveillance, as we did in the Cold War in Moscow. And so special techniques developed to operate in those really hostile environments. But mostly it was physical surveillance with other things thrown in, but large numbers of either vehicular or on foot, and and if you got out of sight for a brief period, they could dispatch teams to go see if you put a chalk mark down or anything like that. And so these techniques, variety of things, in some cases for officers to escape surveillance and get black, became known as Moscow rules, and successfully developed to be able to handle agents in the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. And the challenge for us going forward now, Beijing has become a very difficult environment, and places where they export their technology, because of the advent of all these surveillance cameras, and ability to track cell phones, and then use automation and machine learning and stuff to identify patterns of behavior, and as soon as someone gets out of their pattern. And so it's way more technical now of, when can something see me, when can it not? And so developing, the appropriate tradecraft to deal with that kind of surveillance is a challenge for, our old directorate of of operations. And, but I'm sure they'll work really hard at it. But, that's one way. The new Cold War is different from the old Cold War, is the exploitation of all these new technologies.
Mike, based on your many years of government service, share with our audience your key principles for a successful career.
Sure. So, some of the big ones, I think, are, and I don't know if this would work for everybody, but I really chose jobs and careers that I was really passionate about, where I got tremendous psychological income. The reason I went into the Special Forces and CIA's Directorate of Operations is I wanted to do great deeds, to help our country, and where an individual could really make a difference. And so whatever that is for you, whether it's cyber, space, or undersea, or targeting, or or things like we did, it's hard to match that anywhere else in life. I think it's a very rewarding career, and it's just find your niche. And then at some point, if you're going to go to the higher realms of national security, particularly if you're a career person who's come up either in the military or foreign service or intelligence community, you've got to broaden. You can't just really, you might end up at the head of your agency or the deputy if you're, really good in SIGINT or something at NSA. But, for other jobs, it really helps when you learn some different things, either broader parts of the agency, the DS&T or analysis, if you come from operations, or vice versa, or if you're an analyst, learning enough about operations, if you're going to be the deputy director and you're representing CIA in policy meetings. And if you're in the military or have oversight of the military than understanding, a wider range of warfare. And so in my years out of government, I had acquired a lot of knowledge about nuclear weapons. I was trained initially to use small nuclear weapons, but our whole nuclear arsenal and strategies there, when I had policy oversight of that, became helpful, as well as a lot of our conventional capabilities, space and undersea and global strike, precision strike, and others. And so that broadening at the appropriate time, I think, is important. And then mentors were critical throughout my career, from the Vietnam veterans who taught me a lot about combat tactics, the Eastern European emigres who taught me about what it might be like to operate behind Soviet lines in Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe. And then mentors don't just teach you, they believe in you, or they give you opportunities. And that's certainly what I had at CIA. I was given opportunities way above my grade level by senior officers who, for one reason or another, thought I could do something useful, from the invasion of Grenada to Afghanistan and others. Same thing in the special forces. And then finally, as a policymaker with people like Secretary Gates and Secretary Panetta, who enlarged my portfolio pretty substantially. And that relates to another one. You got to be careful with, I had read something once by former CEO of Goldman Sachs and Secretary of Treasury in the late Bush administration during the financial crisis, Hank Paulson, very successful man, who talked about one of his keys growing up in Goldman Sachs was a thing he called job enlargement, which was starting doing your job well and then looking for opportunities to expand it without, having the sharp elbows that, makes your colleagues want to kill you. But I found that, I didn't know that's what I was doing, but I had practiced that a few times in my career, and luckily it paid off. So those were the main things, I think.
Well, the book is by all means available. It is a fascinating read. I recommend it to you all. And I want to thank Mike Vickers for really a fascinating second interview.
Thank you, Jim.